Julie, a reserved and dedicated secretary, works at a wealthy family's distillery company. After a failed romance, she focuses on work until she is assigned to work with Paul, her boss's provocative brother. During a business trip to Tuscany, they pretend to be in a romantic relationship, which soon evolves into something genuine. However, unforeseen events arise that threaten their growing romance. Can love overcome any obstacle? Don't miss this thrilling story. The sound of Julie Thompson's heels echoed through the halls of Blackwood Spirits, each step a battle against the memories threatening to engulf her. Her fingers clutched the leather briefcase, as if holding the fragments of her carefully patched heart. She stopped in front of the corridor mirror, adjusting a stray strand of her dark brown hair. Her green eyes, once sparkling with hope, now bore shadows of distrust. Julie forced a smile, rehearsing the mask of efficiency that had become her armor. "Today is just another day," she murmured, a mantra she repeated every morning since that fateful night a year ago. A scene that always replayed in her mind. The restaurant was candlelit, the soft music cradling the moment. Julie, radiant in her red dress, gazed adoringly at Mark across the table. "Julie," Mark smiled, taking her hand. "These 2 years have been incredible. You are everything I ever wanted." Julie's heart raced. Could this be the moment? "That's why," Mark continued, "I need to be honest. I've been promoted. I'm moving to London with my fiancé." Julie's world crumbled. The words fiancé and London echoed in her mind as Mark explained about his open relationship and how Julie was special, but Julie shook her head, pushing away the painful memory. Never again, she promised herself. Never again would she be so naive, so vulnerable. She entered Peter Blackwood's office, the aroma of fresh brewed coffee and aged leather greeting her. Peter, a man in his 40s with graying hair and kind eyes, looked up. "Good morning, Julie," he smiled. "Ready for another exciting day in the world of spirits?" Julie nodded, her professional smile already in place. "Always, Mr. Blackwood. Here's today's agenda and the reports you requested." As she explained the appointments, Julie fought against another wave of memories. She was curled up on her apartment sofa, dried tears on her face when the doorbell rang. It was Sarah, her best friend, carrying a bottle of wine and a tub of ice cream. "Sweetheart," Sarah whispered, hugging Julie. "Men are all the same. He's not worth this pain." Julie sobbed against her friend's shoulder. "How could I have been so stupid? 2 years, Sarah. 2 years wasted." "They weren't wasted," Sarah argued. "They were a lesson. Now you know better. Never let anyone have that power over you again." "Julie." Peter's voice brought her back to the present. "Are you okay?" "Sorry, Mr. Blackwood. Just mentally organizing the day's tasks," she replied, her firm voice betraying no inner tumult. Peter watched her with concern in his eyes. "You've been doing exceptional work, Julie. But don't forget to take care of yourself too, okay?" Julie felt a lump in her throat. Peter's kindness always threatened to breach the barriers she had so carefully constructed. "Thank you, sir. I will." Leaving the office, Julie plunged into her routine. Each email answered, each meeting scheduled was another brick in the fortress around her heart. Work was safe. Work wouldn't hurt her. Her eyes fell on a photo on the wall, the Blackwood family in their Tuscan vineyards. Peter smiled alongside his parents, but it was the figure on the left that caught her attention. A tall man with dark hair and a smile that seemed to dare the world. "Paul Blackwood," Julie murmured, an involuntary shiver running down her spine. The infamous older brother of Peter, known for his rebellious nature and irresistible charm. Julie shook her head. Men like Paul were exactly the type she'd sworn to avoid. The phone rang, bringing her back to reality. "Mr. Blackwood's office," Julie speaking. "How can I help?" As she answered the call, Julie couldn't imagine how her meticulously controlled life was about to be turned upside down. Fate, like a master distiller, was ready to mix the ingredients of her existence into a potent and unpredictable concoction. And it would all begin with the imminent arrival of Paul Blackwood, the man who would challenge every wall Julie had built around her heart. The elevator at Blackwood Spirits announced its arrival with a soft ding, and the doors opened to reveal a figure that seemed to draw all the air from the room. Paul Blackwood emerged, his impeccably tailored Italian suit contrasting with the carefree smile on his suntan face. Julie, who was organizing some documents at the reception, sensed Paul's magnetic presence before she saw him. The buzz among the employees diminished, replaced by a silence laden with anticipation. "Well," Paul's voice resonated through the office, rich and melodious. "It seems things got a bit too serious around here in my absence." Julie looked up, her heart involuntarily quickening. Paul was even more impressive in person than in pictures. His eyes, a deep blue, scanned the room before landing on her. For a moment, Julie felt as though she was being assessed. "And who is this enchanting vision?" Paul inquired, approaching with the grace of a predator. Julie straightened her posture, raising an eyebrow challengingly. "Julie Thompson, executive assistant to Mr. Blackwood." "Ah, so you're the famous Julie," Paul smiled, extending his hand. "I've heard a lot about you. Apparently, you're the reason this place hasn't fallen apart yet." Julie hesitated for a second before shaking his hand, feeling an electric shock travel up her arm. "I just do my job, Mr. Blackwood. Please call me Paul." "Mr. Blackwood makes me feel like my father," he winked, still holding her hand. Julie withdrew her hand, ignoring the lingering tingling. "I prefer to keep things professional, Mr. Blackwood. Your brother is waiting for you in his office." Paul tilted his head, amused. "Always so serious, aren't you? Well, that will certainly make things interesting." As Paul walked away towards Peter's office, Julie couldn't help but watch him. There was something magnetic about his presence, an energy that seemed to electrify the air around him. It was dangerous, she knew. Men like Paul Blackwood were like rare malt whiskey, intoxicating, addictive, and ultimately harmful to those who didn't know how to handle them. The rest of the day unfolded in a whirlwind of activity. Paul's presence seemed to have energized the entire office, for better or worse. Julie observed, with a mixture of fascination and apprehension, how he interacted with the staff. Always charming, always unpredictable. Near the end of the day, Julie was called into Peter's office. Upon entering, she found the two Blackwood brothers engaged in a heated discussion. "Paul, you can't just come in and change everything," Peter exclaimed, exasperated. "Why not? It's exactly what this company needs." "A bit of innovation, a touch of boldness," Paul replied, leaning back in his chair with a confident smile. Peter noticed Julie's presence and sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Julie, please explain to my brother why we can't reorganize the entire company structure in a week." Julie felt Paul's intense gaze on her and swallowed hard. "Well, Mr. Blackwood, Paul," she corrected, seeing his amused look. "A change of this magnitude requires careful planning, impact analysis, and most importantly, time for implementation without disrupting our current operations." Paul stood up, approaching Julie. "See, Peter? That's why we need brilliant minds like Julie's involved in this process. Julie, dear, what do you think about working directly with me on this revitalization project?" Julie's heart skipped a beat. Working directly with Paul? It was a unique opportunity, but also incredibly risky. She looked at Peter, who seemed equally surprised and concerned. "I would need to consider it carefully, given my current role and responsibilities," Julie replied diplomatically. Paul smiled, a glint of challenge in his eyes. "Of course, think it over. But don't take too long. Great opportunities don't wait forever." As she left the office, Julie felt her carefully ordered world begin to unravel. Paul Blackwood was like a hurricane, and she was inexorably being drawn into the eye of the storm. That night, in her apartment, Julie faced her reflection in the bathroom mirror. "Don't be fooled," she murmured to herself. "Men like Paul Blackwood don't change. Don't fall for him." But as she prepared for sleep, Julie couldn't avoid wondering if her carefully built defenses would withstand the force of nature that was Paul Blackwood. Dawn had barely touched the horizon of Manhattan when Julie entered the elevator at Blackwood Spirits. Her fingers drummed nervously on the strap of her bag as she ascended to the executive floor. A week had passed since Paul's arrival, and the office still buzzed with a chaotic energy that left her unsettled. The elevator doors opened, and Julie was immediately hit by the unmistakable aroma of premium coffee and something else, something spicy and exotic. Frowning, She followed the scent to the main conference room. Ah, Julie. Right on time. Paul's voice greeted her as soon as she entered the room. He was standing by a table laden with steaming cups and a variety of spices she didn't recognize. Come, taste this. Before Julie could protest, Paul placed a cup in her hands. The aroma was intoxicating. What is this? She asked, hesitant. Paul smiled, his blue eyes sparkling with excitement. The future of Blackwood spirits. A blend of Arabica coffee with notes of cardamom, cinnamon, and a touch of our own oak barrel-aged vodka. Julie took a cautious sip, and her eyes widened. It was surprisingly delicious, the warmth of the alcohol perfectly complementing the spices. Impressive, isn't it? Paul leaned in, dangerously close. Imagine this as a premium coffee liqueur. It could revolutionize the market. It's interesting, Julie admitted, struggling to maintain her composure. But we're not in the coffee business, Mr. Blackwood. Paul. He corrected her automatically. And that's exactly why we need to diversify. The spirits market is saturated. We need to innovate to surprise. At that moment, Peter entered the room, looking exhausted. Paul, what's all this? We have an important meeting in 10 minutes. Which is exactly why I prepared this, little brother, Paul smiled, handing a cup to Peter. We're presenting our new product line to the Italian investors. Julie almost choked on her coffee. What Italian investors? Peter sighed heavily. That's what we need to discuss. Julie, please have a seat. With her heart racing, Julie settled in, feeling the palpable tension between the Blackwood brothers. We've received a partnership proposal from Vittori Beverages, Peter began. They're interested in a joint venture to expand our presence in Europe. The problem, Paul interrupted, is that the Vittori are known for swallowing smaller companies. We need to impress them, show that we're valuable partners, not easy prey. Julie processed the information, her mind already calculating logistics and strategies. And where do I fit into this? The brothers exchanged a look that made Julie's stomach drop. We need you to go to Tuscany, Peter finally said, as our trusted representative. With Paul, he added, almost apologetically. Julie's world seemed to spin. A trip to Italy? With Paul Blackwood? It went against everything she'd promised herself. I can't, she stammered. My work is here. Julie, Paul approached her, his voice smooth but insistent. You're the only one we fully trust for this. You know this company better than anyone. Additionally, Peter added, you speak fluent Italian. You'll be invaluable in the negotiations. Julie felt the weight of their expectant gazes. Part of her wanted to refuse, to cling to the safety of her routine. But another part, a part she had buried long ago, yearned for this adventure. How long? She finally asked. 2 weeks, Paul replied. Enough time to seal the deal and maybe... He paused, an enigmatic smile playing on his lips, uncover some secrets of Tuscany. Julie closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. When she opened them, there was renewed determination in her gaze. All right, she said. I'll go. Paul's smile broadened, a gleam of triumph in his eyes. Excellent. We leave in 2 days. Prepare for the adventure of your life, Miss Thompson. As she left the room to start preparations, Julie couldn't ignore the tremor of excitement running down her spine. She was about to embark on a journey that could change everything. Her career, her life, and though she didn't want to admit it, possibly her heart. The Blackwood's private jet touched down smoothly on the Florence airport runway. Julie blinked, awakening from a restless sleep, and gazed out the window. The Tuscan sun bathed the landscape in golden hues, making her heart race with a mix of anxiety and excitement. Welcome to Italy, Bella. Paul's voice sounded close to her ear, sending an involuntary shiver down her spine. Julie turned, meeting Paul's dangerously close blue eyes. She subtly moved back, adjusting her blazer. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. It looks charming. Paul laughed, a rich sound that made something inside her resonate. Paul, remember? And believe me, you haven't seen anything yet. Descending from the plane, Julie was immediately enveloped by the welcoming warmth and the intoxicating aroma of cypress and lavender. A luxurious car awaited them, and soon they were winding through the scenic Tuscan roads. Our first meeting with the Vittori is tomorrow, Paul explained, flipping through some documents. Today, I thought we might get acquainted with the area. Julie nodded, trying to maintain her professional focus. Great. We can review our strategy, and... Actually, Paul interrupted with a mischievous smile. I had something a little different in mind. Before Julie could protest, the car rounded a bend, revealing a breathtaking view. Rolling hills covered in vineyards stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with cypress trees and ancient stone villas. Welcome to San Gimignano, Paul announced, his eyes shining with what seemed to be genuine enthusiasm. The medieval jewel of Tuscany. Julie couldn't suppress a gasp of admiration. The town, with its medieval towers reaching for the sky, looked like it belonged in a fairy tale. They spent the afternoon wandering the cobbled streets, Paul acting as a surprisingly knowledgeable guide. Julie found herself gradually relaxing, charmed by the history and beauty of the place. And here, Paul said, guiding her into a small enoteca, we're going to have our first lesson on Tuscan wines. The interior was cozy, with shelves lined with bottles and the enticing scent of cheeses and olive oil in the air. The owner, a gray-haired gentleman named Giorgio, greeted them warmly in Italian. Ah, Mr. Blackwood. Che piacere rivederla, Giorgio exclaimed. Julie raised an eyebrow at Paul. Do you come here often? Paul shrugged, an enigmatic smile playing on his lips. Let's just say I have a history with Tuscany. As they tasted wines and antipasti, Julie was surprised by Paul's knowledge of the region and its wines. He spoke passionately about terroir, winemaking, and the nuances of each vintage. You really love this, don't you? Julie asked, watching him with newfound admiration. Paul looked at her, an unexpected intensity in his gaze. There are many things I love, Julie. Some of them I'm just beginning to discover. The air between them seemed to electrify, and Julie felt her cheeks heat up. She looked away, focusing on her glass of Chianti. Night fell over San Gimignano, the city's lights creating an almost magical scene. As they walked back to the car, Julie sensed a subtle shift. Tuscany was working its magic, softening her edges, challenging her preconceptions. So, Paul asked, his voice gentle in the Tuscan night, what did you think of your first day in Italy? Julie hesitated, choosing her words carefully. It was surprising. Much like you, Mr. Blackwood. Paul smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. Believe me, Julie, the surprises are just beginning. As the car wound its way back to the hotel, Julie looked out the window, watching the moonlit Tuscan hills. She had come prepared for business, armed against the charm of Paul Blackwood. But now, under the starlit Tuscan sky, Julie felt her defenses begin to crumble. The true challenge, she realized, wouldn't be closing the deal with the Vittori. It would be guarding her heart against the seductive enigma that was Paul Blackwood and the secrets Tuscany still held. The Tuscan morning sun filtered through the curtains of Julie's hotel room, finding her already awake and mentally going over the agenda for the day. The meeting with the Vittori was set for 10 a.m., and she felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Opening it, Julie found Paul impeccably dressed in a bespoke Italian suit, his infectious smile lighting up the hallway. Good morning, Bella. Ready to conquer the Italian business world? He asked, handing her an espresso cup. Julie accepted the coffee, grateful for the caffeine. As ready as I'll ever be. Did you review the projections I sent last night? Paul's smile faltered for a moment. About that, we need to talk. Breakfast on the terrace? Intrigued and slightly apprehensive, Julie followed him to the hotel terrace. The view was breathtaking, rolling hills covered in vineyards, cypress trees dotting the landscape like green sentinels. But the beauty of the scenery did little to calm Julie's growing anxiety. What's going on, Paul? She asked as they sat down. Paul took a deep breath, his intense blue eyes meeting hers. I received some troubling information about the Vittori last night. It seems they're not just interested in a partnership. Julie's stomach sank. They want to buy us out? Worse, Paul replied, leaning forward. They plan to use our formulas and contacts to launch their own line of premium spirits, essentially shutting us out of the European market. Julie paled. But how are we going to handle this? The meeting is in 2 hours. It was then that the familiar spark returned to Paul's eyes, that blend of daring and mischief that both intrigued and frightened Julie. "I have a plan," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "But it's risky, and I'll need you to trust me completely." Julie hesitated. Trust Paul Blackwood completely? The idea went against all her instincts. But looking into those determined eyes, she felt a wave of something. Excitement? Hope? "What's the plan?" she asked finally. Paul leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We're going to pretend we're a couple." Julie nearly choked on her coffee. "What?" "Think about it," Paul continued, excited. "If they believe we're romantically involved, they'll never suspect we're united in business. We can use this to uncover their true intentions and turn the tables in our favor." Julie blinked, stunned. "This is madness, Paul. It's unethical. It's brilliant," he finished, arching an eyebrow. Against her will, Julie felt a smile tugging at her lips. It was madness, yes, but it was also thrilling. A part of her, a part she'd kept locked away for too long, longed for this adventure. "And how exactly are we supposed to make this look convincing?" she asked, surprising herself with her own boldness. Paul's grin widened, turning into something almost predatory. "Leave that to me, darling. Just follow my lead, and try not to fall for me for real. Okay?" Julie rolled her eyes, but couldn't help the warmth spreading up her neck. "Don't worry about that, Mr. Blackwood. I'm a professional." "Paul," he gently corrected, taking her hand and planting a soft kiss on her fingers. "If we're doing this, you have to call me Paul, dear." The touch of his lips on her skin sent a shiver through Julie's body. She withdrew her hand, trying to ignore the persistent tingling. "All right, Paul," she said, testing the name on her tongue. "But we set clear boundaries, understood? This is strictly professional." Paul nodded, but the gleam in his eyes suggested otherwise. "Of course, strictly professional. Now, how about we rehearse a bit before the meeting? We need to make this convincing." As Paul began outlining the details of their relationship, Julie wondered what exactly she had gotten herself into. The Tuscany around her seemed to vibrate with possibilities, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel something other than caution. Excitement. The game was about to begin, and Julie Thompson was determined not to lose her heart in the process. But as she watched Paul animatedly gesturing, explaining his daring plan, she couldn't help but wonder if it was already too late. The Tuscan sun shone relentlessly over Villa Vittori, an imposing mansion surrounded by centuries-old vineyards. Julie nervously adjusted the pearl necklace around her neck, feeling the weight of the charade she was about to play. "Relax, amore mio," Paul whispered, his hand lightly resting on the small of Julie's back. "You look stunning and utterly in love with me, remember?" Julie took a deep breath, allowing herself to lean slightly into Paul's touch. "Of course, darling," she replied, surprised at how effortlessly the lie rolled off her lips. The villa's doors opened, revealing Giancarlo Vittori, a middle-aged man with a calculated smile and shrewd eyes. Beside him stood an elegantly poised woman whom Julie assumed was his wife, Sofia. "Ah, I nostri ospiti americani," Giancarlo exclaimed, opening his arms in a theatrical gesture of welcome. Paul grinned, shaking Giancarlo's hand enthusiastically. "Giancarlo, my old friend. It's a pleasure to see you again," he said in fluent Italian, surprising Julie. "Allow me to introduce my lovely fiancée, Julie Thompson." Julie's heart skipped a beat. "Fiancée? That wasn't in the script." She forced a radiant smile, extending her hand to Giancarlo. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Signor Vittori." Giancarlo kissed Julie's hand, his eyes twinkling with curiosity. "The pleasure is all mine, Signorina. Or should I say, future Signora Blackwood." Julie laughed, a melodious sound that even surprised her. "Please call me Julie." As they were led inside the villa, Julie felt Paul lean closer, his lips brushing her ear. "Fiancé too much?" he whispered, a hint of concern in his voice. Julie turned, finding Paul's eyes inches from hers. "A little warning would have been nice," she murmured back, "but I think I can handle it, darling." The tour of the Vittori estate was a dizzying blend of business and pleasure. Amid discussions of markets and profit margins, Julie found herself playing the role of an adoring fiancé with alarming ease. A touch here, a loving glance there, and even she started to believe the charade. During a tour of the vineyards, Sophia pulled Julie aside, leaving the men to discuss fermentation techniques. "So, dear," Sophia began, her Italian accent thick with curiosity, "tell me how you and Paul met. It must have been romantic, no?" Julie felt a moment of panic, but quickly composed herself. "Oh, it was quite unexpected. Actually," she began, weaving a story about late-night meetings at the office and shared cappuccinos. With each word, the lie took on a life of its own, colored by the true moments she and Paul had shared. And then, on a trip to Paris, Julie concluded, surprising herself with her own creativity, "He took me to the top of the Eiffel Tower and proposed. It was magical." Sophia sighed, enchanted. "How romantic. You make a lovely couple." Back at the mansion, the group gathered for a business lunch. Julie watched, fascinated, as Paul navigated the conversation with disarming charm and business acumen. "So, Paul," Giancarlo said, filling their glasses with a Brunello from his own winery, "what do you think about expanding our partnership? I have some innovative ideas for the European market." Julie sensed Paul's tension, imperceptible to others. This was the moment they had been waiting for. "I'm intrigued, Giancarlo," Paul replied, his tone casual. "But first a toast. To family," he raised his glass, his eyes meeting Julie's, "and to new beginnings." As the glasses clinked, Julie felt a wave of conflicting emotions. The charade was working, they were in the game. But as the day wore on, the line between reality and performance began to dangerously blur. Later, as they watched the Tuscan sunset from the villa's terrace, Paul approached Julie, wrapping her in an embrace that felt almost real. "You were incredible today," he whispered, his voice rough with admiration. Julie turned in his arms, meeting his eyes. For a moment, she allowed herself to get lost in that deep blue, forgetting the charade, the business, everything. "Paul, she began, but was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. "Ah, the lovebirds," Giancarlo's voice rang out, breaking the spell. "Come, we have much to discuss about the future of our companies." As they followed Giancarlo back inside, Julie felt a shiver of apprehension. The Tuscan moonlight bathed Julie's hotel room, casting dancing shadows on the walls. She sat on the balcony, a glass of red wine in hand, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions after the intense day at Villa Vittori. A soft knock on the door brought her out of her reverie. She knew who it was before she even opened it. "Paul," she said, opening the door. He was there, his jacket discarded, shirt partially unbuttoned, an intense look in his blue eyes. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Julie hesitated for a moment before stepping aside to let him in. The air between them felt charged with unresolved electricity. "I think we have a lot to discuss," Julie began, returning to the balcony. "What did you find out about the Vittori's plans?" Paul followed, leaning against the balustrade beside her. "They are definitely up to something. Giancarlo let slip about a new product line that sounds suspiciously similar to ours." Julie frowned. "So our suspicions were correct. They want to push us out of the market." "Yes, but there's more," Paul said, turning to face her. "Julie, there's something I need to tell you. Something about my past." Julie's heart raced. There was a vulnerability in Paul she had never seen before. "What is it, Paul?" He took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair in an unusually nervous gesture. 5 years ago, I worked for the Vittoris." Julie felt as if the ground had vanished beneath her feet. "What? How? Why?" "It was before I officially joined the family business," Paul explained, his voice laden with remorse. "I was rebellious, wanting to prove my worth outside the shadow of the Blackwood name. The Vittoris offered me a position, and I accepted." Julie tried to process the information. "And what happened?" "I found out they were using my knowledge to spy on Blackwood spirits. When I confronted Giancarlo, he threatened to expose some mistakes from my past. Mistakes that could have destroyed my family's reputation." Julie felt a mix of shock and compassion. "Oh, Paul." "I fled," he continued, the shame evident in his voice. "I returned to the States, begged my father and brother for forgiveness, and vowed to dedicate my life to protecting the Blackwood legacy. Silence fell between them, heavy with revelations. Julie watched Paul, seeing him under a new light. The carefree playboy she thought she knew had much deeper layers and hidden scars. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked gently. Paul turned, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that took her breath away. "Because I trust you, Julie, more than I've trusted anyone in a long time. And because what started as a charade is becoming something very real for me." Julie's heart skipped a beat. She wanted to step back, protect herself, but something held her in place, caught by Paul's gaze. "Paul, she began, but was interrupted by the shrill ring of her phone. Breaking the moment, Julie answered the call. It was Peter, his voice tense on the other end. "Julie, we have a problem," he said without preamble. "I just received information that the Vittoris are planning a hostile takeover. They're going to try to buy the company, by force." Julie paled, her eyes meeting Paul's. "I understand, Peter. We will do what it takes to stop this." Ending the call, Julie felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on her shoulders. "The Vittoris are planning a hostile acquisition," she informed Paul. Paul's face hardened, the vulnerability of moments ago replaced by steely determination. "We won't let that happen. Julie, I need you to trust me now more than ever." Julie hesitated for a moment, years of caution fighting against the growing desire to surrender to this unexpected connection with Paul. Finally, she nodded. "I trust you, Paul," she said softly. "What do we do now?" A slow smile spread across Paul's face, a mix of gratitude and resolve. "Now, my dear fiancé, we show the Vittoris they've messed with the wrong family." As they began to strategize their counterattack, Julie felt a subtle shift in the air between them. The revelations of this night had deepened their connection, making the facade of their relationship increasingly difficult to distinguish from reality. With the Tuscan moon as their witness, Julie and Paul prepared to face not just the Vittoris, but also the growing emotions that threatened to complicate everything. The sun set over the Tuscan vineyards, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Julie nervously adjusted the emerald green silk dress Paul had insisted she wear for this evening's dinner. A special occasion, he had said with that enigmatic smile that intrigued her so much. A soft knock on the door heralded Paul's arrival. When Julie opened it, she was momentarily breathless. Paul was stunning in a bespoke Italian suit, his hair artfully tousled in a way that seemed intentional. "You look breathtaking," Paul said, his eyes sweeping over Julie with an admiration that didn't seem entirely feigned. Julie felt her cheeks heat up. "Thank you. You're not looking too bad yourself." Paul offered his arm with a theatrical flourish. "Ready for the night of your life, Miss Thompson." As they descended to the hotel lobby, Julie noted the admiring glances they received. They indeed looked like a couple stepped straight out of a fashion magazine. "So, will you tell me where we're going?" Julie asked as they settled into a luxurious car. Paul smiled, his eyes gleaming with a secret. "Patience, my sweet. Trust me." After a short drive, the car stopped in front of ornate gates. As they passed through, Julie gasped. Before them stretched a vineyard illuminated by thousands of tiny lights, creating a fairy tale setting. "Paul, this is incredible," Julie whispered, awestruck. He guided her down a path between the vines until they reached a clearing. In the center was a table set for two, surrounded by candles and flowers. A string quartet played softly in the background. "Welcome to Castello d'Amore," Paul said, pulling out Julie's chair. "The oldest and most exclusive vineyard in Tuscany." As they savored exquisite dishes crafted by a renowned chef and sampled rare wines, Julie found herself relaxing, momentarily forgetting about business and conspiracies. "How did you manage this?" she asked, gesturing to the breathtaking scene around them. Paul smiled, slightly bashful. "Let's just say I have some contacts. And I wanted to do something special for you." Julie's heart raced. "Paul, you didn't have to do all this just to maintain our facade." Paul's smile faded, replaced by a serious expression. "Julie, this isn't about the facade. I wanted to do this for you. For us." He stood, extending his hand to her. "Dance with me." As if in a trance, Julie accepted. As they moved slowly to the music, the world around them seemed to disappear. "Julie, Paul murmured, his voice husky with emotion. I know we started this as a plan, a charade, but these past days, I can't pretend anymore that I don't feel something real for you. Julie's heart raced. Part of her wanted to pull back, raise her protective walls. But another part, one that grew stronger every moment, longed to give in to this feeling. Paul, she began, but was silenced when Paul drew her closer, his lips finding hers in a passionate kiss. Time seemed to stop. The kiss was everything Julie had never dared to dream, and more. It was passion, tenderness, and promise all wrapped in a moment of pure magic. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Julie saw in Paul's eyes a reflection of her own conflicting feelings, desire, fear, hope. That was, she whispered. Real, Paul finished, resting his forehead against hers. As real as anything I've ever felt. In that moment, under the Tuscan stars, surrounded by the intoxicating scent of ripe grapes and roses, Julie felt the last barriers around her heart begin to crumble. Paul, she said softly, I'm scared. He held her tighter. Me too. But I believe some things are worth the risk. As the night wore on, Julie and Paul talked, laughed, and danced, setting aside for a few precious hours the worries about the Vittoris and the uncertain future that awaited them. On the way back to the hotel, holding hands in the back seat of the car, Julie realized something fundamental had changed. What had begun as an elaborate charade had transformed into something profoundly true. But as she watched the city lights zip by through the window, a shadow of worry crossed her face. Tomorrow, they would have to face reality. The Vittoris, the threat to the company, the complications of a relationship born from a lie. For now, however, Julie chose to live in the moment, squeezing Paul's hand and allowing herself, for the first time in a long time, to dream of a future full of possibilities. The Tuscan morning sun found Julie and Paul having breakfast on the hotel balcony, the air between them charged with a new intimacy after the previous night. Julie sipped her cappuccino, trying to ignore the tingling on her lips that still remembered Paul's kiss. So, Paul began, his tone trying to sound casual, about last night. Julie's heart quickened. Paul, Before she could continue, they were interrupted by the shrill sound of Paul's phone. He answered it, his expression quickly shifting from irritation to concern. I understand. We'll be there, he said, ending the call with a heavy sigh. What happened? Julie asked, feeling the tension grow. That was Giancarlo. He wants to meet us in an hour to discuss the final terms of the deal, Paul explained, his voice tense. It seems they're ready to make their move. Julie nodded, suddenly feeling very sober. Let's get prepared then. An hour later, they entered the imposing meeting room at Villa Vittori. Giancarlo greeted them with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Ah, the lovebirds have arrived, he exclaimed, his tone falsely jovial. Please take a seat. We have much to discuss. As Giancarlo began outlining his proposal, essentially a hostile takeover disguised as a partnership, Julie noticed a familiar figure entering the room quietly. Isabel, Paul whispered, his voice a mix of surprise and something else Julie couldn't quite place. The woman, a striking brunette with cat-like eyes, smiled predatorily. Hello, Paul. It's been a while. Julie felt a knot form in her stomach. The way Paul and Isabel looked at each other spoke of shared history, one she suspected she wouldn't like hearing about. You know each other? Giancarlo asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Isabel and we worked together in the past, Paul replied, his voice carefully neutral. Oh, come now, darling, Isabel purred, stepping closer to Paul. Let's not be so formal. After all, we were much more than colleagues, weren't we? Julie felt as though she'd been punched in the gut. She looked to Paul for a denial, an explanation, anything. But the guilty look he cast her way told her everything she needed to know. Well, Giancarlo interjected, his smile now openly triumphant, since we're all here, why don't we discuss the real terms of our agreement? The next 2 hours were a blur for Julie. She watched, feeling as though she were outside her own body, as Giancarlo revealed his plan. To use Paul's insider knowledge of Blackwood spirits, gained during his time with the Vittoris, to essentially take over the company. Paul argued, negotiated, even begged, but it was clear that the Vittoris held all the cards. Isabel's presence, a living reminder of Paul's past, seemed to have completely destabilized him. When they finally left the meeting, Julie felt drained and betrayed. The bright Tuscan sun seemed to mock her dark mood. "Julie, I can explain," Paul began as soon as they got into the car. "Explain what exactly?" Julie retorted, her voice trembling with contained emotion. "That you had an affair with Isabel while working for the Vittoris? Or that you essentially sold your family's secrets to them?" Paul closed his eyes, pain evident on his face. "It wasn't like that. I was young, stupid, and now," Julie interrupted. "What is this now, Paul? Another one of your games? Another facade?" "No," Paul exclaimed, grabbing her hands. "What happened between us last night, what's happening now, is real." "Julie, But Julie pulled her hands away, the tears she'd been holding back finally breaking free. "I don't know if I can believe you, Paul. I don't know if I can trust anything right now." The rest of the drive back to the hotel passed in heavy silence. When they arrived, Julie quickly exited the car, ignoring Paul's calls after her. Alone in her room, Julie finally allowed the emotions to overwhelm her. Anger, hurt, confusion, and worst of all, a deep sense of loss for something that had barely begun. As the sun set over Tuscany, painting the sky in blood-red hues, Julie wondered how something that had started as a simple business charade had turned into such a real and painful emotional nightmare. And more importantly, she wondered how they could possibly come out of this with their hearts and Blackwood spirits intact. Night fell over Tuscany, enveloping everything in deep shadows that seemed to reflect Julie's inner turmoil. She was sitting on the balcony of her room, an untouched glass of wine before her, when she heard a soft knock at the door. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, but something, perhaps hope, perhaps masochism, made her rise and open it. Paul stood there, looking as worn out as she felt. His eyes, usually bright and confident, were dark with remorse. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice rough. "Please." Julie hesitated for a moment before stepping aside to allow him in. The silence between them was palpable, heavy with unspoken words and raw emotions. "Julie," Paul began, running his hand through his hair in a nervous gesture. "I know I messed everything up, but I need you to know the whole truth." She crossed her arms, a physical barrier to protect herself. "I'm listening." Paul took a deep breath and began his story. He spoke about his rebellious youth, his desire to prove his worth outside the shadow of the Blackwood family, how the Vittoris seduced him with promises of independence and success. Isabel, she was part of it, he admitted, the shame evident in his voice. "She manipulated me, made me believe she was in love with me. I was young and naive, and I fell right into their trap." Julie listened in silence as Paul described how he gradually realized he was being used. How, when he tried to leave, he was blackmailed with the information he had inadvertently shared. "I ran away like a coward," Paul continued, his voice breaking. "I went back home, confessed everything to my family. They were furious, of course, but they also protected me. It was then that I swore to dedicate my life to fixing my mistakes and protecting the Blackwood legacy." He stepped closer to Julie, his eyes pleading for understanding. "When Peter suggested that I come here with you, I saw a chance to finally settle the score with the Vittoris. But then..." "Then what?" Julie asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Then I met you. For real," Paul replied, a sad smile playing on his lips. "Not the Julie I thought I knew from the office, but the incredible, strong, passionate woman you are." And everything changed. Julie felt her heart racing, struggling against the urge to believe him. "Paul, how can I trust you after all this?" Paul took another step forward, taking her hands in his. "Because I'm giving you the only thing I have left, the truth, raw and uncut. And because," he paused, taking a deep breath, "because I love you, Julie. Truly. No charades, no games." The ensuing silence was deafening. Julie felt her heart beating so loudly she was sure Paul could hear it. She desperately wanted to believe him, but years of caution held her back. "And what about the Vittoris?" she finally asked. "How are we going to get out of this mess?" A familiar spark returned to Paul's eyes. "I have a plan, but it's going to require us to work together, to trust each other completely. Julie studied him for a long moment, weighing everything that had happened, everything at stake. Finally, she nodded slowly. Okay, she said. Let's hear this plan. As Paul laid out his bold strategy to turn the tables on the Vittoris, Julie felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. It wouldn't be easy, and there was still much to be resolved between them, but for the first time since all this madness began, she felt they had a real chance. As the night wore on, Julie and Paul worked side by side, refining the plan, discussing strategies. The tension between them gradually transformed into something different, a partnership, a mutual understanding, and perhaps, just perhaps, the beginning of something deeper and more genuine. When the sun finally began to rise, painting the Tuscan sky in shades of pink and gold, Julie and Paul were ready. Ready to face the Vittoris, ready to save Blackwood spirits, and maybe ready to give a real chance to whatever was growing between them. Julie looked at Paul, seeing in him not only the charming and confident man she always knew, but also the vulnerable and repentant man he had revealed himself to be. And, surprising herself, she found herself smiling. Let's do this, she said, her voice full of determination. Paul smiled back, his eyes shining with a mixture of gratitude and admiration. Together, he replied, reaching out for her hand. And so, hand in hand, they stepped out to face whatever the new day might bring, knowing that no matter the outcome, they would face it together. The Tuscan sun shone mercilessly over Villa Vittori, as if even nature was aware of the tension hanging in the air. Julie and Paul arrived together, their hands intertwined not just as part of their charade, but as a gesture of genuine mutual support. Giancarlo greeted them with his usual predatory smile. Ah, the American lovebirds. I hope you slept well. We have a long day ahead. Julie felt Paul squeeze her hand lightly before releasing it. It was the signal. The game was about to begin. Actually, Giancarlo, Paul began, his voice loaded with a confidence that Julie knew was partly feigned, we have some interesting revelations to share. Giancarlo's smile faltered for a moment. Oh, and what might those be? Paul made a theatrical gesture and Julie stepped forward, holding a folder. Well, for starters, how about discussing these questionable financial transactions we've uncovered? Giancarlo's face visibly paled. What transactions? Julie opened the folder, revealing a series of documents. These here, detailing transfers to offshore accounts, tax evasion, bribes. Shall I continue? The room's door opened and Isabel entered, her gaze quickly capturing the tense scene. What's going on here? Paul turned to her, an ironic smile on his lips. Ah, Isabel. So nice of you to join us. We were just discussing some of your creative contributions to the Vittori accounting. Isabel paled, her eyes widening in realization. You wouldn't dare. Dare what? Giancarlo interrupted, his voice trembling with anger. What are they talking about, Isabel? Julie stepped forward, her voice calm and professional. Mr. Vittori, we have substantial evidence of illegal financial practices within your company. Practices that, if exposed, would not only ruin your reputation, but probably lead you to jail. The ensuing silence was deafening. Giancarlo looked from Julie to Paul, then to Isabel, his face a mask of shock and betrayal. How? How did you get this information? He finally managed to stammer. Paul smiled, but there was no humor in his eyes. Let's just say I learned a few tricks during my time here, and I decided to use them for a greater good this time. Isabel stepped forward, her eyes blazing with fury. You can't do this, Paul. Have you forgotten that we also have compromising information about you? It was Julie's turn to smile. Oh, about that. It turns out we've already taken care of that little problem. She pulled another document from the folder. This is an official statement from Blackwood Spirits, acknowledging and publicly forgiving Paul's past mistakes. Any attempt at blackmail now would be, well, useless. Giancarlo collapsed into a chair. All his previous bravado evaporated. What do you want? Paul stepped closer, his voice firm. It's simple. You will withdraw your bid to purchase Blackwood Spirits. You will cease all attempts at industrial espionage and theft of our formulas. and you will sign a non-compete agreement for 10 years. And if I refuse, Giancarlo challenged, the last flicker of resistance in his eyes. Julie shrugged, her tone casual. Then these documents will find their way to the Italian authorities and the international press. I'm sure they'll find it fascinating. The silence that followed was tense, laden with possibilities. Finally, Giancarlo nodded, defeated. You've won. I'll do as you ask. The next few hours were a whirlwind of paperwork, lawyers, and tense negotiations. When they finally finished, the sun was already setting, bathing the room in tones of gold and red. Julie and Paul left Villa Vittori exhausted but triumphant. As they walked to the car, Paul stopped, turning to Julie. We did it, he said, a genuine smile lighting up his face for the first time in days. Julie felt a smile of her own form in response. Yes, we did. For a moment, they just looked at each other, the adrenaline of victory mingling with something deeper, something that had grown between them throughout this crazy journey. Julie, Paul began, his voice gentle. I know we started this as a charade, but... Julie interrupted him, placing a finger gently on his lips. Sure, I know, she smiled, her eyes shining with a mixture of emotions. How about we discuss this over dinner? A real one this time, with no pretense or games. Paul laughed, the sound rich and genuine. Nothing would make me happier. As they got into the car, Tuscany stretching before them bathed in the golden light of the sunset, Julie felt a wave of hope and possibilities. What had begun as a complicated business mission had transformed into a journey of self-discovery, and, perhaps, the beginning of something truly special. Back in New York, the scent of lavender lingered in the air of Julie's penthouse, mingling with the perfume of freshly lit candles. She nervously adjusted the emerald green silk dress, the same one she had worn on that fateful night in Tuscany. The doorbell rang, making her heart leap. Taking a deep breath, Julie opened the door. Paul was there, stunning and in suit, holding a bottle of artisanal gin. His eyes lit up at the sight of her. Happy 6-month anniversary, he said, his voice husky with emotion. Julie pulled him inside, their lips meeting in a passionate kiss. When they parted, breathless, she smiled. I can hardly believe it's been 6 months since we turned a fake relationship into the most real thing in our lives, Paul finished, grinning. They moved to the balcony, where an intimate table for two was set, with New York City shimmering below them. Paul opened the bottle of gin, pouring 2 glasses. To us, he toasted, and to all the wonderful surprises life has in store. Julie clinked her glass to his, savoring the gin. Her eyes widened in recognition. This is... Paul nodded, his eyes gleaming. The recipe we created together in Tuscany. Finally perfected and ready for launch. Dash Distilling Love, Julie read the label, chuckling softly. A fitting name. As they dined, they reminisced about the past 6 months. The challenges of leading Blackwood spirits together. Late nights at the office turning into impromptu romantic dinners. Business trips that became mini honeymoons. After dessert, Paul suddenly became serious. Julie, there's something I need to ask you. Julie's heart raced as Paul knelt before her, taking a small velvet box from his pocket. Julie Thompson, he began, his voice slightly trembling. You've transformed my life in ways I never imagined possible. We started with a charade, but found the deepest truth. You make me want to be better every day. So, he opened the box, revealing a dazzling ring. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? So we can continue distilling our love, together, forever. Tears of happiness sparkled in Julie's eyes. Yes, she whispered, 1,000 times yes. As Paul slipped the ring onto her finger, Julie realized that her entire life had been preparation for this moment. Every decision, every challenge, every calculated risk had led her to Paul, to this love that defied all odds. Embraced on the balcony, with the city as their witness, Julie and Paul sealed their commitment with a passionate kiss. The future stretched before them, as bright and promising as the New York skyline. That night, as the stars shone above and the scent of gin and love lingered in the air, Julie knew she had found not just a business partner, but her soulmate. And together, they were ready to distill a life of love, adventure, and success. What had started as a charade in Tuscany had turned into the sweetest reality in New York. And this, Julie knew, was just the beginning of their love story. If you enjoyed the story, don't miss the next ones appearing on your screen. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel. It means a lot. See you next time.